Hello everybody, today I will be making Ahsoka Tano's Lightsaber Hilt, almost completely out of wood. Now, this is the one from Rebels and the Mandalorian, and this is the main hand one. I will be making the offhand one in another video, so stick around for that. Anyway, let's jump right in. So I started off by printing out the template from SKS Props. I'll put a link to his video on where he made Ahsoka's lightsabers, and you will be able to find his templates there as well, for free. Now, I would like to say I'm definitely not trying to steal his content. All credit goes to him, and I think he did an amazing job on these sabers. However, I will be making mine a bit differently than he did. He made his completely out of foam, which turned out awesome, but I prefer working with wood, so I'm going to give that a shot. But I do think you should definitely go check out his channel if you haven't already. Anyways, I cut out one side of the main hand saber. I didn't cut out the whole saber, just like the main part as you can see in the video. And I took some plywood that was 15 over 32 inches thick. And I traced the saber onto the plywood. And I then flipped the template over and traced it again because I would need the saber to be twice as thick as this plywood. I then went and used a jigsaw to cut out these two pieces. Now, a bandsaw would have been super helpful right now, however, I don't have one, so I'm stuck with using a jigsaw. I then used some ordinary wood glue to glue these two pieces together and used clamps to hold it together until it dries. Once it dried, I used a belt sander to sand down the two pieces until they were flush together. I also used a more fine grit sandpaper to sand down the faces to get them smooth. Afterwards, I used a rotary tool with a sanding bit on it to sand down the little part that comes in. Now to start adding some detail. I cut out the centerpiece from the template. I got 2 sheets of this basswood from Hobby Lobby. That was 1/8 by 3 by 24 inches. I traced the template onto the sheet and cut it out using a rotary tool. I also tried using a utility knife in some places, and to my surprise, it worked. I just had to score over it a few times. I also cut out the middle piece and sanded the whole thing down to the correct size. I referred to the template so I would know where to apply wood glue. I put the two pieces together and set this sheet of plywood and a bin of sand on top of it to act as a sort of clamp. You of course could just use plain clamps, it doesn't really matter. And once that had dried, I repeated the whole process for the other side. I went back to the belt sander to sand down the saber so everything was flush. I also went ahead and rounded off the edges. Once I was done, I used a sanding block to get everything super smooth. I did want this to end up looking like metal. I also used a rotary tool and sandpaper to fine-tune some areas and really just clean up dried wood glue. I took a yardstick from Home Depot. You could also use a ruler or paint stick, anything that is about 1/4 inch thick. I cut off 2 inches of it. I then used the bottom of this saber to trace onto the yardstick. I then drew an outline around it that was about 1/4 inch out because I needed this piece to be a bit wider. I sanded it down to the size that I had drawn and I glued it on to the end of the saber. Make sure you glue this onto the correct end though. Next, I took another sheet of basswood, but this time it was 3 over 32 by 3 by 24 inches. Using my ruler, I marked out 5 spaces that were 1.5 by 1 inches and cut them out. I took one of them and rounded off the edges. I then traced that one onto 2 more pieces and sanded them down to the same size. On these last 2 pieces, I sanded them down a little bit smaller than the other 3. Now, I had 3 big pieces and 2 small pieces. I used wood glue to glue these pieces together in a staggering pattern, and glued that piece onto the end of the saber. Now to make the clip. I went back to the yardstick and traced the template of the clip onto it. I cut it out and sanded it down. Then, to drill out the hole, I used this little piece for the rotary tool. I then traced this piece onto the bottom of the saber and used the rotary tool to grind down part of it so that the clip would fit flush. I then glued it on. Make sure you refer to the template to make sure you get this placement right. I then took this little piece of yardstick that was the same width as the piece of the clip, just shorter, and I glued it on the very bottom as shown. I next took a piece of the yardstick and cut out a small circle. I used a rotary tool to give it some detail, and I glued it onto the clip using super glue. Now to start work on the emitter. I traced out the head of the saber onto the plywood, and I cut it out and sanded it to the correct size. I then drew the semicircle onto it and used a rotary tool to grind down that part. I also marked out this area on the inside and sanded it down to give me this shape. Now, back to that sheet of basswood that was about 1/8 inch thick. I traced out the head of the saber on it and drew around the edge because I needed this piece to be a bit bigger. Once it was cut out, I glued it on. Then on top of that, I glued the piece of the emitter. Now back to the plywood. I cut out a piece and drew a circle on it that had a diameter of about 1 1/8 inch. Once it was cut out, I drew an inner circle that had about a 1/2 inch diameter. I then used my rotary tool to bevel the piece from the bigger circle to the smaller circle to create a dome. I then traced this circle onto the sheet of basswood that was 3/32 inches thick. I traced it twice. On one of the circles, I drew a bit on the inside to make it smaller. On the other, I drew a bit around the outside to make it a bit larger. Now back to the dome. I used some hot glue to glue it onto the emitter. Now, with those two circles cut out, I glued them together and glued them onto the saber. Next, I took a piece of PVC pipe with an outer diameter of 3/4 inches. I cut off a piece that was about 1/4 inch. I also sanded it down to make sure it was smooth, then used hot glue to glue it on to the end of the saber. Next, for the knob on the saber, I used a template to trace it onto a piece of yardstick. And then, once it was cut out, I traced a smaller circle from the template onto it, and I used the rotary tool to round it off as shown. I then used this piece from my rotary tool and ground out part of it to give it a nice detail. I then glued it onto the saber. I went back to the sheet of basswood that was 3/32 inches thick. I used the template to trace out the large and small parts of the button. I super glued the two pieces together and then glued them onto the body. Next, I took a popsicle stick and traced out 4 diamonds from the template. A popsicle stick is thin enough that you're able to cut it using a utility knife. I just had to go over it a few times. I then referred to the template to know where to glue on the diamonds. I cut out this part of the template and cut off the ends so it was 5 sections long. It'll make sense why I did this later. I traced it out onto the plywood 2 times. Then, I cut off one section so it was 4 across and cut it to be thinner as shown. I then traced that piece onto the plywood 2 times. I cut out all 4 pieces and used wood glue to glue together the matching pieces. On the longer piece, I sketched out a dome that was as tall as the rectangle on the template. I then used the sander to sand it down to the semicircle shape. I then traced that dome onto the shorter piece and drew it slightly smaller and sanded that down. I'm not sure if that makes sense, but you'll see where I'm going with this. Then on the larger dome, I used the template to trace out 5 sections, and on the smaller dome, I traced out 4 sections. I left a space in between each section for a saw to fit, and I used a rotary tool to cut them apart. I then glued them together in an alternating pattern, as you can see. Once it was dry, I needed it to be rounded off on the 2 ends, so I used the belt sander to do so until it fit into the saber. And I used wood glue to glue it in. I used clamps to hold it together and used a paper towel to wipe up excess glue. I got a D-shaped ring from Home Depot that was 1 inch. I used a rotary tool to grind out part of the end clip and continued to test fit it until the D-ring fit in. I took this scrap piece of yardstick to close in the ring. Once it was dried, I sanded it down to fit more flesh. Time for painting. I started off by adding a coat of black spray paint that would also act as a primer. I then taped off the areas that needed to be black. There seemed to be a lot of different ways this saber can be painted. Everything I found on the internet seems to be colored a bit differently in different areas, but I chose a design that I thought looked good, and I taped those black areas. I would put tape over the area and then use a utility knife to cut around the area. The areas that I kept black were the knob on the bottom, the stripes on the handle, part of the button, and this area around the diamonds. Then I used gold spray paint to hit the areas that I wanted to be gold. I then taped over those areas. This was part of the emitter and part of the button. I then went over everything with a few layers of silver. Once that was dry, I pulled all of the tape off to reveal the final product.
Alright everybody, thanks for sticking around to the end. I will be making the offhand saber in another video, so be sure to check that out. If you happen to like the video, please consider leaving a like down below. It would mean so much to me, and I will see you in another video.